Picture this. You wake up one morning and your country just doesn't exist anymore. One day you're part of the world's largest superpower, the mighty Soviet Union, and the next it's gone. 15 new flags, 15 new nations, and 70 years of empire, erased almost overnight. And here's the wild part. It didn't fall to an invasion or a bomb or even a war. It fell because of its own leaders. A coup, a few signatures in a forest, and the world as we knew it changed forever. We're talking about the collapse of a global giant, the USSR, and the domino of events that began with Gorbachev's reforms, spiraled through tanks in the streets of Moscow, and ended with Yeltsin declaring a new Russia. So how did an empire built on power, fear, and control crumble from within? And what really happened behind closed doors when the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist? Stick around, because once you see how it all unraveled, you'll never look at world history the same way again. Imagine this for a second. You wake up one morning, turn on the TV, and find out that your entire country has vanished. Not conquered, not invaded, just gone. One day you're living in the world's largest empire, the Soviet Union, a nation that stretched across 11 time zones, commanded a massive army, and rivaled the United States for control of the planet. And the next day, it's history. 15 brand new countries appear on the map. People who went to bed as Soviets woke up as Russians, Ukrainians, Latvians, Uzbeks, their identities rewritten overnight. Now that sounds impossible, right? How does something that big, that powerful just fall apart? Well, that's exactly what happened in 1991. And here's the crazy part. It didn't happen because of some great war or invasion. No nuclear strike, no foreign army marching into Moscow. The Soviet Union collapsed from the inside. It started with one man, Mikhail Gorbachev, who tried to save the system by changing it. But those changes opened doors that couldn't be closed. They sparked movements, protests, and independence cries all across the republics. And when the people found their voice, the empire began to shake. Then came the August Coup, tanks in the streets, generals trying to turn back time, and a young leader named Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank, defying them all. What happened in those few tense days flipped the world upside down. And just a few months later, in a quiet forest in Belarus, three men sat down, signed a short document, and ended 70 years of Soviet power with a single line. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics no longer exists. That's how the Cold War ended. That's how one of the most powerful empires in human history, the same one that put the first man in space, that terrified the West for decades, simply vanished. But how did it come to that point? What went wrong inside the Soviet machine? And why did its own leaders pull the plug on their own empire? Because this, the collapse of the USSR, wasn't just the end of a country, it was the birth of a new world order. So let's rewind to the 1980s, when it all started to crack. To really understand how the Soviet Union collapsed, we've got to rewind to the late 1980s, a time when the cracks in the system were starting to show, even if most people didn't want to admit it. On the surface, the USSR still looked powerful. It had the biggest army on Earth, nuclear weapons that could destroy the planet several times over, and a global image of strength. But behind the scenes, things weren't looking so glorious. The economy was in serious trouble. Stores were running out of food, factories were outdated, and people were spending hours in line just to buy bread or sugar. Imagine living in a country that could build rockets to the moon, but couldn't keep milk on the shelves. The truth was, the Soviet system, the same one that had fueled its rise to power, was falling apart from within. It was too rigid, too slow, too controlled. For decades, the government had kept a tight grip on everything: the economy, the media, even what people could say or think. But by the 1980s, that grip was choking the system itself. People were tired, frustrated, and hungry, not just for food, but for change. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev. When he took power in 1985, he was unlike the gray, older leaders who came before him. Gorbachev was young, energetic, and, most importantly, he knew something had to change. The Soviet Union couldn't keep running on fear and control forever. It was falling behind the West, economically, technologically, and morally. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to make socialism work again, but in a new way. So he introduced two big ideas that would define his time in power: perestroika and glasnost. Now, those are fancy Russian words, but their meaning is simple. Perestroika meant restructuring. Gorbachev wanted to rebuild the Soviet economy, allow a bit more freedom in business, reduce government control, and bring in modern management. Glasnost meant openness. It was about giving people the right to speak, to question, to criticize. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could openly talk about problems that had always been brushed under the rug: corruption, censorship, even past crimes of the government. At first, people were shocked. Imagine living your whole life where you can't question the government, and suddenly you're allowed to talk about everything, openly, on TV, in newspapers, in the streets. It was like a lid had been lifted off a boiling pot. But here's the thing. Once you give people a voice, you can't take it back. Glasnost didn't just let people complain about food shortages. It made them start asking bigger questions. Questions like, why are we struggling while the rest of the world is advancing? Why do we have to obey Moscow when our local leaders can't even fix our roads? Do we even want to be part of this union anymore? And these weren't just random people talking. Whole republics, places like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Georgia, started demanding real autonomy. For them, it wasn't just about reforms. It was about freedom, independence, identity. These were nations with their own cultures and histories, and now, under glasnost, they were remembering who they really were. Gorbachev thought his reforms would save the Soviet Union, but instead they began to unravel it. Every speech, every protest, every open discussion loosened the Soviet grip just a little more. And the more open things became, the more people realized just how broken the system truly was. By the late 1980s, the USSR was living in a paradox. The government was trying to control reform, but reform was making control impossible. Old hardliners wanted to go back to the way things were, but the people were moving forward, fast. And as we're about to see, it was only a matter of time before all that pressure exploded. The stage was set. The Soviet Union was standing on a knife's edge. One side, reform and survival; the other, collapse and chaos. And in 1991, that knife finally cut deep. So by the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union was like a dam with cracks forming everywhere. Gorbachev's reforms had opened the floodgates. People were finally allowed to speak, question, and dream out loud. And once those voices started rising, there was no way to silence them again. The first big wave of change came from the Baltic states: Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. These small countries on the edge of Europe had been forced into the Soviet Union during World War II, and they never truly accepted it. Deep down, they had always seen themselves as occupied nations, not Soviet republics. So when glasnost arrived, they grabbed the opportunity with both hands. And here's what's amazing. Their fight for independence didn't start with guns or riots. It started with songs. People began gathering in massive crowds, sometimes hundreds of thousands strong, singing old national songs that had been banned for decades. This became known as the Singing Revolution. It was powerful, peaceful, and deeply emotional. An entire nation singing for freedom. Imagine the courage that took, knowing the KGB could be watching, knowing the Soviet army was still right there, and still standing shoulder to shoulder, singing your heart out for independence. And they didn't stop there. In 1989, the people of the Baltics did something the world had never seen before. On August 23rd, nearly 2 million people joined hands across 3 countries, from Vilnius in Lithuania, through Riga in Latvia, to Tallinn in Estonia, forming a human chain nearly 400 miles long. It was called the Baltic Way. Their message was simple, but impossible to ignore. We want our freedom back. These images shocked the world, and they inspired others. Soon, people across the Soviet Union started looking at the Baltics and thinking, if they can do it, maybe we can too. In Georgia, massive protests erupted in Tbilisi, where citizens demanded independence and an end to Moscow's rule. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, local conflicts that had been buried for decades resurfaced as nationalist movements grew stronger. And in Ukraine, a quiet but powerful awakening began. Ukrainians started to question their place in the Union, asking, if Moscow can't feed us, can't protect us, and can't even listen to us, why do we need Moscow at all? Across all these republics, you could feel it. A new sense of identity was forming. People weren't thinking of themselves as Soviets anymore. They were Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, and they were starting to remember what independence felt like. Gorbachev, meanwhile, found himself in a nightmare situation. His whole plan had been to modernize the Soviet Union, not to destroy it. He believed that giving people a voice would strengthen the system, make it more honest, more flexible. But instead, every new freedom became a step away from Moscow's control. The more he opened the system, the more republics began to pull away. And it wasn't just the people anymore. Now, even the local leaders of these republics started seeing independence as an opportunity. They could lead their own countries instead of answering to Moscow. Then came the March 1991 referendum. Gorbachev tried to save the Union by asking the people directly, do you want to preserve the USSR as a renewed federation? In some parts of the country, people voted yes, but in others, especially in the Baltics, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova, they refused to even participate. Those republics wanted out, plain and simple. And even though the majority across the remaining areas voted to stay, the truth was already clear. The unity of the Soviet Union was gone. The republics were no longer waiting for permission to leave. They were already acting like independent nations. The whole system was starting to split apart, piece by piece. You can almost picture it, a giant Soviet map on the wall, with pins marking every republic. And one by one, those pins start falling. Lithuania declared independence first in 1990. Latvia and Estonia soon followed. By the summer of 1991, the domino effect was in full swing, and that's when the real panic set in. Not just among the people, but among the old guard in Moscow. The Communist Party hardliners, the men who had spent their lives defending the Soviet system, watched as it all began to crumble before their eyes. They saw Gorbachev as too weak, too soft, too Western, and they decided to do something about it. In August 1991, they made their move, a desperate attempt to turn back the clock and save the Soviet Union once and for all. What happened next would be one of the most dramatic moments in modern history. Tanks on the streets, soldiers surrounding the Kremlin, Gorbachev under house arrest. The world held its breath. The Soviet Union was about to face its breaking point. By the summer of 1991, the Soviet Union was hanging by a thread. Gorbachev's reforms had opened Pandora's box. People were demanding freedom. Republics were declaring independence. And the once mighty Communist Party was losing its grip. Inside the Kremlin, the old guard, the hardline officials who had spent their lives defending the Soviet system, were furious. They believed Gorbachev had gone too far. In their eyes, he wasn't saving the Union. He was destroying it. And so in August of that year, they decided to take matters into their own hands. On August 18, 1991, while Gorbachev was vacationing with his family at his dacha in Crimea, a group of top government and military officials, ministers, generals, and KGB chiefs surrounded his residence. They cut off his phone lines, shut down his communications, and told him he was no longer in charge. They claimed Gorbachev was too ill to govern. But that was a lie. He was perfectly fine, just being held prisoner by his own government. The next morning, the coup plotters made their move. They announced on Soviet television that a new emergency committee was taking control of the country. They declared martial law, banned protests, and sent tanks rolling into Moscow. They wanted to reverse all of Gorbachev's reforms, silence the growing independence movements, and restore the old Soviet order. For ordinary citizens, it was terrifying. The world's largest nuclear power, now in chaos. No one knew who was in charge or what would happen next. It looked like the USSR was about to return to its darkest days. But then, out of nowhere, someone stood up to them. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, which was still technically part of the Soviet Union, refused to accept the coup. While tanks surrounded the Russian White House, the parliament building in Moscow, Yeltsin climbed on top of one of those tanks and gave a speech to the crowd. Standing tall, defiant, holding a piece of paper in his hand, he declared, "We will not surrender our freedom." Cameras captured that moment, and within hours, it was broadcast across the world. That single image, Yeltsin standing on a tank, became the symbol of resistance. It told millions of people, don't give up. The coup can be stopped. Crowds of ordinary citizens began pouring into the streets. They surrounded government buildings, built barricades, and stood in front of tanks, unarmed, to protect the parliament. People brought food, flowers, and banners. They sang songs and chanted for freedom. For 3 tense days, Moscow looked like a war zone teetering on the edge of something massive. The coup leaders expected fear. Instead, they got defiance. Even within the army, cracks started to show. Some soldiers refused to fire on civilians. Tank crews defected and joined Yeltsin's side. One by one, the coup's power began to crumble. By August 21st, just 3 days after it began, the coup collapsed. The hardliners were arrested or fled. Gorbachev was released and flown back to Moscow, but something had changed. Everything had changed. The coup that was supposed to save the Soviet Union had, in fact, destroyed it. Gorbachev returned to power, but he was no longer in control. His credibility was shattered. The Communist Party, which had ruled for decades, was now discredited and humiliated. And Boris Yeltsin, the man who had stood on a tank, emerged as the new face of leadership, the man the people trusted. The Soviet Union, once a symbol of unshakable strength, had just been exposed as fragile and divided. And after the coup, there was no going back. Republics began declaring independence faster than ever before. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, one after another they broke away. The empire that had once controlled half of Europe was disintegrating in front of the world's eyes. The August Coup didn't save the Soviet Union, it signed its death warrant. And just a few months later, that final signature would come, deep in a forest in Belarus, when 3 men sat down and quietly ended an empire. When the August Coup collapsed, it wasn't just a political failure, it was the moment the last bit of faith in the Soviet Union vanished. Imagine it, a country that once stretched across 11 time zones, home to nearly 300 million people, now standing on shaky legs. The government in Moscow had lost control. The old Communist Party was banned. And suddenly, for the first time in 70 years, the republics realized they didn't have to listen anymore. The mood across the Soviet Union was electric, unpredictable, and emotional. It was like everyone could feel history cracking open in real time. After decades of being ruled from Moscow, the different republics, places like Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, the Baltic states, and the Central Asian nations started to say, enough. We're done, BP. And one by one, they walked out. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were among the first. They'd been demanding independence for years, and when the coup failed, they didn't waste a second. Their parliaments declared full independence and raised their own flags, no longer afraid of Moscow's retaliation. For them, it wasn't rebellion anymore. It was liberation. Then came Ukraine, a huge moment. Ukraine was the second most powerful republic after Russia, the agricultural and industrial heart of the Soviet Union. On August 24, 1991, just 3 days after the coup collapsed, Ukraine's parliament voted to declare independence. That single act was like pulling a massive brick out of the foundation. The structure couldn't hold without it. Within weeks, Belarus, Moldova, and Azerbaijan followed. Georgia had already left earlier that year. Even Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan, the Central Asian republics that had once been among the most loyal to Moscow, decided they were better off on their own. It was like watching dominoes fall, one after another, each one hitting the next with unstoppable momentum. The map of the Soviet Union, once painted in solid red, was now breaking apart into a dozen new nations, each with its own language, flag, and dreams of sovereignty. For ordinary people, it was confusing and emotional. Some felt pride, a sense of finally being free after generations of control. Others felt fear, wondering what independence would really mean. Would there be food, jobs, stability? The future was wide open, and no one knew what it would look like. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Gorbachev tried desperately to keep the Union together. Maybe not as one country, but as a kind of loose alliance. He proposed a new Union treaty that would let republics remain connected while having more freedom. But it was too late. The trust was gone, the will was gone, and most importantly, the people were gone. The leaders of the republics weren't looking to renegotiate. They were building new nations. By December 1991, only a few months after the failed coup, what had once been the world's largest superpower was reduced to fragments. The Soviet Union, the same force that had defeated Nazi Germany, raced the US to the moon, and terrified the West for half a century, was now an idea whose time had ended. The dominoes had all fallen, but there was still one final act. The quiet, almost unbelievable moment when the Soviet Union, after nearly 70 years of existence, was officially declared over. And that moment would happen in a snowy forest in Belarus, behind closed doors, with just three men and a single piece of paper that ended an empire. All right, so here we are. The Soviet Union has been falling apart for months. One republic after another has declared independence. The coup has failed. The people have lost faith. Gorbachev, the man who tried to save the system, is holding on, but just barely. And then comes December. The world is cold, tense, and uncertain. No one really knows what's going to happen next. Is there still a Soviet Union? Is Gorbachev still in charge? Who's running the show? It's like watching an empire dissolve in real time, but without any official ending. Until a few men decided to make one. On December 8th, 1991, deep in a forest in Belarus, three leaders, Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus, met in a government retreat called Belavezha, pronounced Belavezha, to talk about what to do next. Officially, it was just a meeting, nothing dramatic. But what happened there would change history. These three men represented the largest and most powerful republics left in the Soviet Union. And they all knew the truth. The USSR was no longer functioning. The government had no authority. The economy was collapsing. Communication between Moscow and the republics was breaking down. It wasn't really a union anymore, just the shell of one. So they did something bold. They drafted and signed a document known as the Belavezha Accords, a short agreement that, in plain words, declared the Soviet Union no longer existed. Just like that. 70 years of Soviet history, gone with a few signatures and a simple line. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality, ceases to exist. In its place, they created something new, the Commonwealth of Independent States, USSR, a loose organization meant to help the former republics cooperate, mostly in economic and security matters. But everyone knew what it really meant. The Soviet Union was finished. Now here's the dramatic part. They didn't tell Gorbachev right away. Imagine that. The man who had led the entire Soviet Union, sitting in Moscow, still technically president of the USSR, had no idea that just a few hundred miles away, three of his top republic leaders had ended his country. When the news reached him, Gorbachev was furious. He called it illegal, unconstitutional, a betrayal. And in a way, he was right. There was no precedent for dissolving a superpower. But at the same time, what could he really do? There was no army left loyal enough to back him, no party structure to support him, and no republics willing to stay. The power was gone. Over the next few weeks, the rest of the republics accepted the decision. Even the Central Asian nations, which had been hesitant at first, joined the new Commonwealth. The idea of the Union had simply run out of road. And then, on December 25th, 1991, Christmas Day, Gorbachev went on television to give one final speech. His face was calm, but you could hear the weight in his voice. He announced that he was resigning as president of the Soviet Union and that the office itself, the presidency of a country that no longer existed, would cease to exist as well. Later that night at exactly 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag, the red flag with the hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin for the very last time. In its place, the Russian tricolor, white, blue, and red, was raised. And just like that, the Soviet Union, the superpower that had defined the 20th century, that had rivaled America, that had changed the course of world history, was gone. The world woke up on December 26th to a new reality. 15 independent countries now stood where one empire once ruled. The Cold War was over. But the end of the USSR wasn't just a political event, it was a human one. Millions of people suddenly found themselves part of new nations, with new borders, new leaders, new identities. Some celebrated, some mourned, some didn't even know what to feel. And that's the strange beauty and tragedy of it. The Soviet Union didn't die in battle or collapse in ruins. It ended in signatures, speeches, and silence. A superpower dissolved not with explosions, but with pens. It's Christmas Day, a holiday that wasn't even celebrated in the officially atheist Soviet Union for most of its history. But on this night, something much bigger than Christmas is happening. Inside the Kremlin, the mood is heavy, silent, and surreal. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who rose from a small farming village in southern Russia to become the leader of one of the world's greatest superpowers, sits alone at his desk. Papers are neatly stacked. The television cameras are ready, and in front of him lies his final speech, the one that will end it all. He takes a breath, looks into the camera, and begins. His voice is calm but tired, the kind of tone that comes from someone who's been carrying the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. He says, "Dear compatriots, I am ending my duties as president of the USSR." Just like that, the office of the President of the Soviet Union, an institution that symbolized the power of an empire for decades, no longer exists. And what's wild is that he's not overthrown, not arrested, not exiled. He's resigning peacefully, not because he wants to, but because there's simply no country left to lead. Let that sink in for a second. The leader of the Soviet Union, the same nation that terrified the West, that built nuclear missiles, that sent the first man into space, is now announcing on live television that the country he governs doesn't exist anymore. It's one of those moments where history feels almost too big to process. Gorbachev thanks the people who believed in him. He speaks about how he tried to reform the system through perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, hoping to make socialism more humane, more flexible. He admits it didn't work out the way he planned. He talks about the challenges, the economic crisis, the rise of nationalism, the failed coup, the disintegration of the Union. But above all, he talks about freedom, how the people of the Soviet republics had chosen their own paths, and how he respected that choice. It's both dignified and heartbreaking. You can feel that he's not angry, just sad. Sad that his dream of a renewed, modernized Soviet Union is gone. Sad that decades of sacrifice, achievement, and history have ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet farewell. And as he finishes his speech, there's no cheering, no applause, just silence. A few hours later, at 7:32 p.m. Moscow time, the red Soviet flag with the hammer and sickle, that iconic symbol of power that once flew over half the planet, is lowered from the Kremlin's flagpole for the last time. In its place, the white, blue, and red flag of the Russian Federation rises into the cold winter sky. Down below, people are watching, some are crying, others are stunned. Many don't even know what to feel. They've lived their entire lives as citizens of the USSR, and suddenly that identity is gone. For them, it's like waking up in a different world. For Gorbachev, it's the end of a chapter, not just of his presidency, but of an entire era. He walks out of his office that night, no guards, no ceremony, just a man closing the door behind him, leaving the Kremlin for the last time as the last leader of the Soviet Union. And that's the image history remembers. One man walking away from the heart of an empire that no longer exists. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union was gone, and the world had entered a new age, one that no one fully understood yet. But in that moment, as the red flag came down for the last time, one thing was clear. The story of the 20th century had just ended, and a new one was about to begin. When the red flag came down from the Kremlin that night, The world didn't just lose a country, it lost one of the two pillars that had defined global power for nearly half a century. For decades, the world had lived in a kind of tense balance. The Cold War. The United States on one side, the Soviet Union on the other. Two superpowers, two ideologies, two visions of the future locked in a constant struggle. Capitalism versus communism, freedom versus control. But with the Soviet Union gone, that balance vanished. Suddenly, there was only one superpower left standing, the United States. And the 1990s were born into what people started calling the New World Order. It was a phrase that sounded almost mysterious, but it really meant a world led by a single dominant power for the first time in modern history. No more Iron Curtain, no more Soviet bloc. The Cold War was over and the West had won. Across Europe, borders shifted, economies opened up, and new democracies took shape. Former Soviet republics like Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states began transforming into independent nations, each trying to build its own identity, government, and economy from scratch. It wasn't easy. Many faced chaos, corruption, and poverty, but for the first time in decades, they had freedom to decide their future. Meanwhile, Russia, now led by Boris Yeltsin, was trying to reinvent itself. Overnight, it had gone from being the heart of an empire to being just another country, struggling with inflation, unemployment, and a broken economy. The 1990s in Russia were wild. Massive privatization, billionaires rising from nowhere, and ordinary people watching their savings vanish as prices exploded. It was a decade of both hope and hardship, the price of transition. And while all this was happening, the rest of the world was watching and adjusting. The United States stepped into the role of global leader, shaping foreign policy, trade, and military alliances. NATO expanded eastward, welcoming countries that had once been part of the Soviet sphere. It was seen as a triumph of Western democracy, but in Moscow it stirred resentment that would simmer for years. China, on the other hand, quietly took notes. The fall of the USSR became a lesson for Beijing, proof of what could happen if political control slipped, even slightly. So while China embraced capitalism economically, it held on tightly to its one-party system. The world order was shifting, fast, and then there were the ordinary people, 290 million of them who had once called themselves Soviets. For them, the collapse wasn't just politics, it was deeply personal. Imagine being told your country no longer exists, your passport is invalid, your currency is worthless. The anthem you grew up singing, oh, gone. Overnight, you're not Soviet anymore. You're Russian, Ukrainian, Estonian, Kazakh, whether you were ready for it or not. Some embraced it, celebrating newfound independence. Others felt lost, nostalgic for the stability and pride of the old Soviet days. Supermarkets might have been emptier, but life had felt predictable. Now everything was uncertain, and in the middle of it all, the world was transforming. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Germany was reunited. Eastern Europe was opening to the West. Technology was exploding. The internet, personal computers, and globalization were connecting people in ways that had never been possible before. It was as if the 20th century, defined by wars, dictatorships, and ideological battles, had suddenly handed the baton to a new age of global capitalism, democracy, and digital revolution. But of course, history is never that simple. The end of the Soviet Union didn't erase the tensions it created. It only changed their shape. Many of the conflicts and rivalries that began in 1991 that are still playing out today, from power struggles in Eastern Europe to debates about NATO, democracy, and influence. The world we live in now, the headlines we see every day, are still echoes of that moment when the Soviet Union fell. The fall of the USSR wasn't just the end of a superpower, it was the moment the modern world began. So let's take a step back for a moment and really think about what just happened. The Soviet Union, 70 years of history, power, ideology, and identity, vanished in less than a year. Not with a war, not with an invasion, not with bombs or explosions. It ended with signatures, speeches, and the courage of people standing up for their freedom. It's almost unbelievable when you picture it. Imagine growing up in a world dominated by one of the most powerful nations on earth. and suddenly it's gone. A whole way of life disappears almost overnight. That's the scale of what we're talking about. And yet, this wasn't just an ending, it was also a beginning. A beginning for 15 new nations, each with the chance to define themselves, to build their own futures, and to step onto the world stage as independent actors. A beginning for a new global order, where the Cold War's binary division of the world dissolved, leaving room for new alliances, new conflicts, and new possibilities. Gorbachev's dream of reform may not have saved the Soviet Union, but it did something even more profound. It proved that even the most rigid, intimidating systems can change when people demand it. It reminded the world that power is not just in tanks, flags, or armies. It's in ideas, voices, and courage. And think about this. Every protest, every song, every declaration of independence was a spark. And those sparks set an empire on fire, changing the course of history forever. The fall of the Soviet Union also reminds us of how fragile empires are, no matter how big or intimidating they seem. It's a lesson about leadership, reform, and the power of ordinary people to rewrite history. Today, the world looks very different than it did in 1991. Borders have shifted, nations have risen, and old conflicts continue to echo. But we can trace all of it back to those dramatic months: the August Coup, the independence movements, the Belavezha Accords, and Gorbachev's final farewell. History didn't just record the collapse of the USSR, it learned from it, carried its lessons forward, and reminded us all that change is possible, even in the most unexpected ways. So next time you see a map, or hear about a country, or even think about power and control, remember this: empires can crumble, but the stories, the people, and the courage that built them, those live on. And that, my friend, is why the dissolution of the Soviet Union isn't just history. It's a story of humanity, of risk, of change, and of the extraordinary power of ordinary people to shape the world. If this story blew your mind, and let's be honest, how could it not? Don't let it end here. Hit that like button if you love diving into history the way we just did. Big moments, real people, and the kind of stories that change the world. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon, because there's so much more where this came from. We're talking untold events, behind-the-scenes history, and the fascinating how and why that textbooks never tell you. Drop a comment, too. I want to know what part of the Soviet collapse shocked you the most. Was it the people standing on tanks in Moscow, the singing revolution across the Baltics, or Gorbachev resigning as the last president of a country that no longer existed? Let's talk about it. History is more fun when we experience it together. And remember, understanding history isn't just about dates and facts, it's about stories, decisions, and people, and how those choices shape the world we live in today. So stick around, because the next story we unpack will be just as wild, just as unforgettable, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.